See, to establish my local credibility, I want you to see, this is H for Hollister. Thank you very much. I don't know how many of the rest of you can still get into your block sweater from high school. The class of 1957. Oh, one of the best vintage. It's like wine. It was a good year, 1957. And I thought, because I have to explain something, the mascot, you all know the mascot for Hollister High School, right? Hay balers. The hay balers, yeah. Well, what's happened, and I'm distressed that nobody asked some of the old guys, was that they began to change the high school name. When you graduated from what was called Hollister High School with the H, you actually got a diploma that said San Benito County Joint Union High School. That's what it said on the thing. But nobody ever called it that. Now they're calling it. So I want to ask our local supervisor here, Anthony, what the hell happened?
You know, I have no idea. Things get screwed here in San Benito County at times.
Well, I mean, one day what? You woke up one day, you went to bed, it was Hollister High School, and you woke up and it was San Benito High School? What the hell is that? So which, you know you're old when you're sitting at a table with a county supervisor who says he's been a supervisor for 14 years, and then he lists the people that were before him, and then I am reminded that I went to high school with his father. Oh my God. I just thought, I honest to God had not done this for about 5 years, and I can still pretty well get into it, a little stretching. And I also realized that doing the math, we're coming up on 60. We did, I think we did our 50th in here, 40th maybe, 45th, I don't know. We did it somewhere in here. And I had just come back from China, taking a group to China, and I remember I was so jet lagged, and I actually came in on the airplane and came straight here, that I have no memory of the high school reunion at all, not a bit. And I was the MC. Maybe there's a moral there. I don't know. I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored to be. And some of you have heard me say this before, and I would say it out loud with no hesitation. That I think the Japanese American Citizens League is one of the premier organizations on this planet, not just this country, this planet. And I have to say, I read the Pacific Citizen in its hard copy form. And way to go for taking out that big ad in the. Usually the holiday issue is a lot of self-congratulatory and people plugging travel agents and stuff. And by God, there was that full-page ad, protesting the effort to try to go to digital with the newspaper. Thank God you did that. Thank God that the organization heard the screaming, because at this juncture, they need to stay with the hard copy. They just do. I don't know what they were thinking. First of all, they didn't ask anybody. That was mistake number one. The organization that preaches democracy doesn't ask the membership what to do. Come on. So it's working out fine. They've learned some things. They'll tighten it up a little bit. But Marcia and I were talking about it earlier as I was coming in, that the hard copy of the Pacific Citizen is, hard copy still matters. You can take it in the living room. You can take it in the bathroom, for God's sakes, right? Well, you can't do that with, can you? I don't know if anybody wheels their computer in. sits there with their iPhone reading the Pacific Citizen in the bathroom? I'm wondering. Okay, so I've made the point, but I will say that the JACL, and I want to talk a little bit about the JACL in the early years, but the situation that occurred after 9/11, when the United States, we were reeling. We got, hit in the stomach. First organization, first national organization to come out, because immediately the American population did what they, unfortunately, seem to always do. They went after people who looked like the people flying the airplane. They thought, Oklahoma City, they chased a couple of Pakistanis around for a while until we find out that it wasn't anybody from Southwest Asia. But in this particular instance, people just struck out in absolute fury and went after the people they thought might be. And the problem is, we're not good about who the people might be. We're terrible at that. They're beating up Sikhs, for God's sakes. They don't know a Sikh, from a Muslim, from a Hindu, national JACL, right out of the chute. National statement. Even George Bush made a national statement right away, which was quite good. It was nice to see people saying, wait a minute, whoa, we've done this before. We shouldn't be doing it again. And that was back 2001. Well, friends and neighbors, I hate to tell you, but the judge already mentioned it. I'm going to hit it a little harder. He has to be judicial. I don't, all right? He has to be polite. I don't. And that is that we're in one again. And it is so frustrating for me and for a lot of you, I'm sure, and people who deal with this subject. This is what I do. This is how I make my living. I make my living. I've been teaching for 54 years. I still don't have a clue how to do it, right? I'm not sure. I go home after a class and Annie will ask me, she'll say, well, how'd it go? And I say, I don't know, it didn't go well, maybe tomorrow. We're still working at it, but part of my job, I see myself as a retroactive affirmative action officer. That's my job. My job is to put people back into the history who were either taken out or ignored. Right? And then, by God, if we can find something that needs to be righted, some people say, including my dad, who said, "Why are you mucking around with our history all the time?" Because he was a little bit sort of right of me. Oh my God. He would always say, you shouldn't. When we did the rescinding of the 1943 resolution of opposing the return of the Japanese and Japanese Americans after the war, he was furious because he'd been a county supervisor. He said, "What are you doing? Well, first of all, what are you doing messing around with my county?" That was the first thing, because he saw himself as more of an emperor than a supervisor. But also, he believed that because I was not here, that it wasn't something that I was qualified to talk about. And of course, then I went into a long thing about, then we're not going to be doing much Roman history, and we're not going to be doing a lot of Greek history, and there's a lot of things we're going to have to not do because I can't have been there. But in that process, we discovered that the other counties had obviously done the same thing. And his argument was, well, it's done. Move on, you can't. And I see things as teachable moments. And that was a teachable moment. That's where we could very nicely and politely go to the boards of supervisors and say, you've got this on your books. You should change it. Just rescind it. Doesn't cost you anything. Isn't that great to come to a board of supervisors and ask them to do something that doesn't cost anything?
It hardly ever happens.
Hardly ever happens, see, because things always cost. And in fact, it happened over in Monterey County where that question actually came up. Where one of the supervisors, when we were getting ready to do it, said, is this going to cost us anything? No, it's just going to cost you an apology. That's all. And a recognition that in 1943, not you, but the Board of Supervisors then, the representative of the people, wasn't thinking very clearly, and maybe you could just undo it a little bit. The real reason, of course, is that we continue to bring those up because maybe they'll begin to see things that are happening now. So we went to the three boys. Well, I'm doing this all the time. Let me give you another example. In the 40s, actually starting right after World War I, see, now you're going to have in your heads, this is important, sort of a schematic of American history in order for any of this to work. All right? I don't have a slide that shows American history and World War I and the Depression and World War II. I'm assuming that you'll be able to understand it when War I, War II, War III, War IV. There have been more than that. Okay, so right after World War I, the United States went into an anti-foreign paroxysm, if you will. World War I didn't go well. Oh yeah, we were on the winning side, but people died, and they died in Europe, and nobody really understood why. And then, the president wanted to do the League of Nations, and they wouldn't let him in, and so America turned away, literally, from the world in the early 20s. And during that paroxysm, a number of national organizations went on record against all kinds of things, but mostly against immigrants. Yeah, we've been there before. In 1924, we passed the National Origins Quota Act, in which we gave groups quotas that they could come in. Largest quota, actually, I believe, most of the time was either Germany or England, or those two. But it was Northern and Western Europe had the biggest quotas. And in 1924, what was Japan's quota? 0. 0. That's not like 10 nor 12, 0. China's quota, 0. Now, it would give you a sense as to how the United States felt about you just to look at those numbers, wouldn't you think? I mean, you'd look at that and go, geez, well, that set off riots in Tokyo. Because there had been an agreement in place up to that time which the Japanese government had very carefully adhered to. Some of your forebears came in on what was known as the Gentleman's Agreement, and the picture brides and that whole era, but that was people were paying attention and following the rules. And in 1924, the United States said no. Well, Japan was very upset about the fact that internationally, they lost face in that. And they'd been very proud about keeping the deal. And actually, the government changed. There was actually some riots in Tokyo in 1924. So starting in the 20s, there's a lot of anti-foreign stuff, which is going to carry wax and wane, depending upon who's in the barrel at that time, all the way through. One of the organizations that went on an anti-foreign campaign was the Grange. Grange. Now, a lot of you think that the Grange puts on breakfasts on Sunday mornings and has jazzercise on Thursday nights because there's a Grange Hall in every town. The Patrons of Husbandry is the name of the organization. They started in the 60s, 1860s. And they started out as a wonderful, radical kind of farmers' union against the railroads. Well, they got sidetracked by some other issues. And they became one of the major anti-immigration organizations, along with the American Legion, the Elks, a lot of wonderful organizations that took positions against immigration. And in the case of the Grange, they went a little farther. And they started to preach against the immigration from Japan. And then during the war, the Grange, as did a number of other local organizations, went on record in 1943 opposing the return of the people of Japanese ancestry who had, or at 1943, were in camp, or off fighting and doing other things. So the local Granges did that. Well, I don't know if you noticed, but the Grange has gone through a resurgence. They've become active again. They've painted their halls. And they've become active in a sort of an organic farmers thing, yeoman farmers group. And you see the Grange women wearing gingham and bonnets and stuff. I'm exaggerating, they don't wear gingham and bonnets, but that's kind of the organization. So I watched them come back. And one day, the local Grange over here in Live Oak, over in Santa Cruz County, I sent him a letter, and I said, you know, did you know that your organization was on record opposing the return of the Japanese from camp? And it was passed in 1943 by the state Grange, the state organization. You could hear it hit, boom. Oh, yikes. Well, yeah, oh, yikes. Know your own history. That pebble, and all it was actually, it was an email, it wasn't a letter. I just sent an email to the guy that was running the Live Oak Grange. I said, you know, you might want to look into this. Have you got any Japanese members, by the way? You don't have any. Have you ever wondered why that might be? It's not really, but I thought maybe I'd really hook them. 2 years later, a man by the name of Takashi Yogi, who happened to be on the board, state board of the Grange, went back in their records, found 6 different times that the Grange had gone on a position against the return of the Japanese during the war. Brought it up to the state Grange in Sacramento, embarrassed the hell out of them, and they passed a resolution and rescinded them all. And most importantly, they apologized. And they sent the apology to the JACL National, apologizing for something they had done, not them, but their organization had done back in 1943. And they learned in the process a whole lot about themselves. That's what we do. What we do is we poke and we just, now, sometimes we have to invent a moment. We don't have to this time. When I say this time, I'm talking 2016. The boards of directors, you guys that are up here, you're getting sworn in. This one's different. This one's different in its intensity. This one's different in its national exposure. Like it or not, there's a couple of candidates who are saying some very outrageous things, all right? In doing so, I mean, I couldn't make up a better example of what not to say and what the problem really is, right? You couldn't make that up, but it creates the conversation. So what are you going to do? And it's, okay, when I started doing research on this place, and I got to tell you, I look out the windows of this joint, some things I see out here that I just, first of all, the green grass, my God, green grass. We haven't seen green grass in 3 or 4 years. It is gorgeous out here. Isn't it wonderful? We got a storm coming right now. So it's a great moment. But I look out at this wondrous place, and when I started doing research here, which was, probably 40 years ago at least, one of the things I couldn't understand particularly that period, 1941-42, right in here, because we knew what happened. We saw it. We saw Executive Order 9066. We saw all the things that led up to it. And I kept interviewing people all over the place, non-Japanese, and I kept saying to them, where were you? There's going to be historians talking to you someday about 2016. And they're going to want to know, where were you? And this is scary business, Because historians can take things and twist them all around. That's what we do. But in this particular instance, when I went around and asked people, including my dad, including my mom, and all kinds of people, and I thought well-meaning people, I tried to get as much across this, I'd say a couple hundred. I kept asking them, I say, where were you? Why didn't you say something? And they all said, almost to a person, we were worried about ourselves. They went back to 1941, December 7, and they talked about sitting around a kitchen table, and they talked about family meetings and deciding what the hell are we going to do here? I mean, this is serious business. The draft was already in place. The mechanism for getting people into the military was already in place, but there was a lot of things that had to happen. And nobody knew how it was going to affect each family. And so each family is having, I've often saw in my mind this sort of oilcloth, red checkered tablecloth, where families are sitting around, obviously within the Japanese community and outside, trying to decide what they're going to do. For the Japanese community, scary business. I'm going to go back to that in a second. For the non-Japanese community, they're also up against some things. They don't know where they're going to go. School, look, you've got a school year that's going to continue. How's this all going to play out? So their main concern was inward, themselves. They worried about themselves. And what we did, I have to mention this. Hold on, I've got a prop. It's not just because, the Watsonville Santa Cruz JACL is here that I do these things, but let me see if I can find it. I may give this over. Oh, no. Oh, there it is. Rummage, rummage. This is the publication that came from the now infamous reenactment. When the Watsonville Santa Cruz JACL got this crazy idea to reenact the removal. People walking down Beach Street, getting on a bus, going to Salinas. And in this process, we did something which I think was brilliant. And it was a committee. You have to understand, this comes on in the year following, the spring following 9/11. And we had huge discussions about whether we needed to continue to do this. That this seemed to it could be seen as off the mark a little bit, but no, this is exactly on the mark. We finally worked ourselves into a little courageous frenzy and said, no, we have to do this. Because that's what this is about. This is about what happens when you're not paying attention. But the twist, and if you don't have a copy of this, you are culturally deprived. I just can't, I'm sorry, you're one of the lesser groups. You need to see Moss or Martin. Do we have any more? Are there any more in existence? No? Yes? No. They're done. Gone. Zip.
1,000 copies. 1,500 copies.
Was it done digitally? I don't remember. It wasn't. Whoa. That's too bad. That's too bad. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Marcia, but there you are. But what we did here, we went out and overtly, see, you model the behavior you want. Okay? We could have filled this book with pictures and articles about people who misbehaved, who said bad things about the Japanese, and who, we know all those people. A lot of them were elected. We are what we elect. And in this case, that's good, all right? In this case, that's good. There's another. And for all of you elected officials, obviously, were you originally elected? Yeah. Oh, he was elected, so the judge is okay too. We sought out the people who did stand up. What a concept. And with the help of Jane Boyd, with the help of historians and the committee and everybody in town in Watsonville, We hunted them down. Well, obviously, many of them were deceased. We found their descendants, and we honored them. See, you model the behavior you want. What you want is people to stand up and say, no. No, I'm sorry. This is not constitutional. You shouldn't be doing this. All right? And it was probably the most emotional day to see the representation of the Japanese community walking down Beach Street, checking in at the Vets Hall, and then moving down in a almost exact period bus to get on, as if they were going to go off to the rodeo grounds in Salinas. So the reason I bring this up is to bring up the part about how do we behave? What do we do? A couple of little stories just to kind of bring you up to date about some of the things. This organization, this San Benito County JCL, I'm going to need. It's my floor director is handing off. Hold on. By the way, Kevin back there, Kevin, did you shoot the news when I was there or after?
After.
Had things pretty well healed by then?
As far as?
Oh, I don't know. I think there was a lot of dust in the air. I think a lot of us, just. For some of you who don't know, I was a weatherman for almost a year at KCBA, Channel 35. Kevin was a shooter, a videographer there afterwards. And they asked me if I wanted to do the weather, and I said, well, low clouds and fog burning off by noon. What? And then they said, but you've got 3 minutes. And I said, well, I'll talk about the snowballs in Albuquerque or something. And they said, or you could talk about something local. I had 3 minutes on the nightly news. All I had to do was get the weather out of the way. And of course, it was during a drought, so it was easy. It was very easy. I'd say, no, it's nothing coming. Now, speaking of nothing, let me give you the history of, and I did that. And I had 3 minutes on the nightly news to myself. And then I realized that nobody was listening. See, when you're doing TV, you don't know. You're assuming there's somebody out there. Nobody in the studio was paying any attention. I knew that because they're all primping and, doing their hair and everything while the camera's off of them. But in the process, I learned the power of television. Television is very powerful. The largest telephone response that I got. By the way, anybody that looks at the nightly news to find out what the weather is, I wouldn't suggest that. That's probably, there's some better places now that you can go where you can look at the satellite on your own. And by the way, there's a pretty good lump of stuff coming. I've been watching it. It's on its way. So in the final process, on the 19th of February, I wasn't going to let that go by. And so I did a really quick weather thing. It still hadn't rained. And then I talked about Executive Order 9066 and showed some really nice slides of, the camp and the Salinas Rodeo Grounds and a lot of stuff. And I actually did a live shot out in front of the rodeo grounds, which was still the old rodeo grounds at that time. The phone rang off the hooks all over the studio. People grabbing the phone, they had no idea. The response we got, the angry response. If I thought that we were done with the story and that everybody had gotten it, boy, was that was a convincing moment. There was a lot of anger out there, a lot of anger about it, and I thought, we got a lot of work to do. And of course, Mas Hashimoto and I and a couple of us spend some of our time, Mas all of his time. He'll tell this story anywhere, and so will I. And that's one of the reasons I'm here. So here's the deal. you see the disc going there? The disc is going as I'm sorting. I want to make sure. The building. I want to talk just a bit about the building. The building that this JACL chapter has. By the way, did you mention, I couldn't hear it all, was it mentioned that this is the only continuously operating JACL chapter in the country? Oh, something y'all should know. This funny little county, this wonderful little county, spawned by an anti-Mexican movement in the 1870s, so, as was Salinas, the city, as people got tired of dealing in the Spanish language over in Monterey and it began to pull away, and San Benito County was formed. And one of the reasons they didn't put the county seat in San Juan Bautista, where you could have been like emperor or something. If it, yeah. Right, okay. But over in Hollister was simply that there were too many Mexicans living in San Juan. So they created a Yankee town. And then when they decided to name it, in the meeting, oh God, you can't make this up. They said, well, you know, there were about 6 or 7 investors. And they said, well, we're going to name this place. It was Rancho San Justo, but that ain't going to work. So, and the guy stood up and said, hey, it isn't going to be San this or Santa that. Whatever we're going to call this town. The largest stockholder of that organization at that moment was a man named W.W. Hollister. They said, we'll name it after him. So they named it Hollister. Maybe 3 months later, he sold and moved. Serious. Moved down next to Santa Barbara, the Hollister Ranch, all that down there. He left. I grew up in Hollister. There was nobody named Hollister in town. I would go around and say, excuse me, who's this town named for? I don't know. Somebody. So, the building. You think I forget? I'm going to come back to the building. So the building is a sweet little building. Let's see. What do you got for a construction date? Top of your head. What do you? 35. 35. Interesting year, by the way. Just about the time that the Japanese school in Castroville was built. A lot of things going on mid-30s. But in this particular instance, it was an association hall. It was a place for the community to meet. And what I was looking at lately was how the hall was used. Now, it had a Japanese school in it. That was one of the purposes of the building. And the Issei had decided that maybe the kids would be better off, no, maybe they would be better off too, if the kids learned a little Japanese culture besides the wonderful individualism that they were getting in public school, which is, you know, look out for yourself, to hell with the group, you know, that kind of stuff, which is, you know, that's kind of America, bootstrapped. And so they began to set up these schools that were all over the started in the 20s, and setting up schools where they gave both cultural and language instruction. And that was going on here over on First Street, building, very unassuming building, and for reasons that are very clear. If you built, by the 30s, if you built a building that looked Japanese, it would catch on fire. It just would. It's a spontaneous combustion thing where the buildings seem to just pop up and explode and burn. Because the anti-Japanese thing was very strong. And it gets obviously stronger as we get later in the 30s. So you build a building that doesn't look Japanese. It doesn't have the nice hipped roof. It doesn't look like the Buddhist temple did over in Watsonville or the Buddhist temple in Salinas, where you get these sweeping, wonderful. No, you camouflage the building. You just subtle little things. So they built the building in 35. They taught the Japanese school there. They had meetings. The Japanese American Citizens League chapter met there. And on December 7th, actually the 8th, bam, all the Japanese schools were closed in California. Bang. And it's an interesting thing. I don't know if the United States government could close anything overnight anywhere today. I just can't imagine how they would do that. But they were able, just simply by contacting the sheriffs, by a telephone call. Sheriff Fruits was his name actually here in 1941-42. You contacted the sheriff, and the sheriff came over and said, shut it down. And most of the Japanese communities were smart enough that it probably wouldn't be a good idea at that particular moment to keep them running. So they closed. But what I've learned, and the part that's just really so cool, is that because, okay, the Japanese community here is confronted with the same decision that's everywhere else. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? I can't imagine the fear, what must have been going through people's minds as to how to respond. What do you do? Now, a lot of my younger Turk radical students are beginning to say things like, well, why didn't they resist? Oh, come on. Well, why didn't they say something? No, you don't understand. Right at that particular moment, they really didn't have any choice. And of course, now here, the JACL chapter was, the president was Henry Omoto. Henry was his English was good. Of course, he's American born. He was, the Nisei. So he then spoke eloquently all the time to the newspaper. He gave statements almost weekly about the loyalty that his community had and how they were going to help in the war effort. And they did. So the hall then becomes a place, but the community still has to decide, because all of a sudden it's becoming clear that something's going to happen. They're going to have to go. So the group would meet periodically in the hall, but the hall was closed. Legally, they couldn't. So they got permission. They got permission from the sheriff, and they got permission from the local war relocation people that they could meet. And some of the meetings were 5-6 hours long, and there were no minutes, unfortunately. There's no documents that survive from those discussions. But I know enough from interviewing people who were in similar situations all over the place and in that one, that a lot of it was very practical stuff about what are we going to do with our stuff? What are we going to do with the crops that are in the ground if we have to go? And then there was that little permission, that voluntary evacuation period. And then they're saying, maybe we can go somewhere else. Maybe we can go as a group. And so you have these tense meetings where people are going, I don't know. The very conservative elements are saying, well, no, let's just sit tight, see what happens. And others are saying, no, let's get the hell out of here. We can go, because the Nisei could get permission to go look and see if maybe there's a place to go. The Watsonville group did it. This group didn't get to that point. The automobile salvage yards became busy because a lot of the Japanese community are looking for auto parts. They're building trailers. They're trying to, think about old cars. They can't put all their stuff in their car, and a lot of them didn't have that kind of truck. So they were building trailers. They were doing, it's just this hotbed of activity, and it was surrounding that little hall building. And over time, they had a number of meetings there before, of course, the orders finally came. And I don't need to go through that because you already know the orders, what they were, and the sequences. It's something that's been pounded into most of you who weren't involved, probably to your boredom. You can hold that one. So we'll talk a little bit about afterward, and then I'll quit. So the question came up. We had a meeting. I had a meeting with Tony and Kurt the other day. And their question was a good one, because their basic question was, what was it like to come back here? How was San Juan and San Benito County compared to, say, Watsonville or Salinas or Monterey? And you should know, and probably some of you do know, that I would, and Annie asked me this last night, she said, well, how do they rank, the communities? And I would put San Juan Bautista and Salinas as the most difficult, the toughest, the least receptive. And I put Watsonville kind of down in the middle. Santa Cruz isn't really an element at that particular point because the Japanese community was already pretty small over that direction of Santa Cruz County. But wonderfully, Monterey. Monterey is one of those things where you just look at that and go, yikes, how did that happen? Because Monterey overtly, publicly welcomed the Japanese community back. And I don't know very many places. And it has a lot to do with the composition of the community. There were a lot of lefty, liberal, pinko, non-Japanese over there, artists and stuff, that helped to get that going. But San Juan Bautista was very difficult. Now, Salinas is easy to understand because the National Guard Tank Company, before the war started, the draft was instituted in September of 1940. So, and you had a draft obligation if you were a young man, so you could join the National Guard. Well, everybody thought the National Guard was an out. No problem, you're gonna march around a couple weeks a year. The tank company that was in Salinas ended up in the Philippines at the wrong moment. And they were caught when Japan invaded the Philippines, and they became major players in the Bataan Death March. A lot of those Salinas kids got killed. So that, I'm telling you, those phone calls that I was getting at the TV studio were part of that. Part of the unforgiveness of part of that community because of Bataan. Even though, and I'll say this out loud, I know you already know this, that there's no connection between what the Japanese army was doing and the strawberry growers from the Salinas Valley who were in camp, right? There's no connection. Neither should there be any connection between the two kids that did what they did in San Bernardino and the Muslim community in Livermore there's no connection. All right, but you're saying, well, yeah, but we don't know. Of course not, you don't know. But the assumption is in this place, and the judge will tell you, that until it's proven otherwise, there's no connection. Your response will always be, this is different. No, it's not. Sorry. And there's historians yet unborn who are going to get you if you do this one wrong. And you still got a chance to do it right. I mean, what was I talking about? It was my floor director. What was that? Do you have any idea what I was going to say? I'm having one of those moments. See if anybody's been paying enough attention to actually work it back to where I got off. So now this is a test. You think I'm making a mistake. I'm doing this on purpose. Where was I going with this?
You're telling about San Juan and how they didn't
thank you.
go off-
That's right, San Juan. Good, thank you. Tony should remember San Juan. He's a big part of San Juan, and he's a major player. He's on every committee. Honest to God, I kept asking him, say cemetery? Oh, yep, I'm on that one. He's on everything. Okay, so why? Salinas we'll put to the tank company, and I'm going to put it also on the growers and shippers. The Growers and Shippers Association of Salinas Valley came out overtly in 43 and 44. Opposing the return of the Japanese. Of course they did. It's competition. They were getting their butts kicked by the Japanese farmers. It was in their interest that the Japanese went away. They all of a sudden said, wow, we can really make some money at this and be a little sloppy and lazy. Well, you could, but then if they come back, it'll be all over again. So in this particular instance, San Benito County, by the way, the Japanese population, roughly 500, at the beginning of the war, 400, 500 in there. The return, 25% of the Japanese returned by 1950. And by the way, I am guessing that half of that number is new people. It's not returnees. I would say that the returnee ratio in this valley was the lowest of anywhere in the region. There's two issues. There's a man by the name of John Borovich. John Borovich was a seaman first class on the USS Arizona. And he was there at Pearl Harbor. He's still there. All right? He was the first serviceman to die from this county. His brother Pete went on a tear throughout the war. Throughout the war, writing letters to the editor. His brother Pete never was able to separate the people flying the airplanes that sank the ship that his brother was on from the good Japanese and Japanese Americans from this valley that were at that time in Poston. He couldn't do it. That's such a key thing, right? To be able to do that. My dad could never do it. My dad was in the South Pacific, in the Navy, and I always had trouble getting him to understand, because he would say, oh, I know Kei Kamamoto, I love him, he's a great farmer, he's a good farmer. And boy, I tell you, my dad was farm advisor, and to hear that, and he said that about every Japanese American and farmer in this valley. He's a good farmer. Well, to me, that was the greatest compliment my dad could ever give anybody. He was a good farmer. He's a good farmer. And of course, that all meant, hard work, all the things that go with it. So we've got Pete writing letters. And as it became clear, 43, 44, that the camps are going to close, Pete wrote a couple of scurrilous letters, just terrible, to the freelance. They were picked up by the Gilroy Advocate newspaper. I've read all those newspapers, by the way. That's the only way you can do this. And so you've got Pete Borovich pounding the drum on one end, and then the really hard one because it came late. In April of 45, a young, I think he was a PFC or something, very low ranking. He was a medical corpsman named Bob Nyland, was killed. Son of Art. Art Nyland, what would you call him? A major player? Is a major player
He was a major player, rancher, farmer.
Right. He was a big dude. He owned a lot of property here. And one of his sons, his other son was Harvey, was killed. April 45, late in the Philippines. Art went on a tear. Art went on a tear, and those signs began to appear in the windows, here, on the fences, here. I won't offend you using the diminutive form of Japanese, the three-letter version that starts with J. It's a word I cannot say, actually. It just, even academically, if I'm reading out loud, I'll cheat, because it is so offensive. Because I know for the people about whom it is, it's so offensive. Anyway, he was putting those signs up all over the place. So that when the group began to come back, that's what they hit. Just before they started to come, summer 45. Summer of 45, the United States Army saw that they were going to have a problem, because the problem was going to be their Nisei vets and the vets, the MIS vets coming back from the Pacific and the Nisei coming back from Europe. They were going to hit this. And the Army didn't want them to hit this. The Army didn't want them to hit those signs, because the Army knew what those guys had done. They came in and had meetings and held seminars to try to get the local people to understand the contributions that those guys had made in the behalf of, the freedom of the United States and all the things that didn't do much good, because it continued. It continued, and it was bad enough that most people who lived here prior to 1940 and prior to 1941 didn't come back. And I know that a lot of you probably have heard from people, those of you who are descendants from people who did come back. But the population dropped off by 75% and stayed at about 150 for the next 20, 30 years. The Japanese population was very small, running 500. And it was concentrated here in the valley, in the San Juan Valley, and also off on Fairview Road on the other side of Hollister, at the seed farm, at the Morse seed farm, which eventually became Ferry Morse, the Hollister Seed Company, which was a Japanese-owned and operated seed business. The Japanese had found little niches that they could work, and most of them didn't return. But the JACL chapter from this strange little place, they continued to meet in camp under blankets, risking physical abuse. I mean, the JACL had some real issues because there were a lot of people in camp who blamed them being in camp on the JACL. They could have done something, or they sold out, or all those things that happened. And so, but these guys continued to meet, and it's my understanding, and it's confirmed by the leadership, that this is the only JACL chapter in the country that has a continuous operation from the 30s to the present. Isn't that a wondrous thing? I mean, I think that's a wondrous thing. So, let me conclude. I'm gonna do this to you. Part of the problem of doing this talk that I do, and Moss goes around to other places, I go around, is that if I were to publicize it, most of the people that would come would be Japanese and Japanese Americans. I find that really frustrating. Because you see, you all aren't the ones that need to hear this. You already know this. I've often thought of doing a bait and switch, where I go, say, to Monterey and say, I'm going to talk about the Japanese during the war, and then right at the last minute, switch it. You know, after the whole group gets here and they're all Japanese and Japanese Americans, and I'll say, okay, I'm going to talk about the Italians. Because you don't know, probably, what happened to the Italians during the war. It wasn't as bad, but it's not an issue of good, bad, worse, better. They got hammered. German Americans and German aliens got hammered. There weren't many, but they did. The Constitution got mangled, all right? You forget the three groups. And so here's the deal. If I was on a board of, if I just got sworn in, God forbid for that group that got me on the board because you got trouble, okay? Because one of the things I want to say is the very first things we will do is put on a series of seminars and symposiums on the history of Islam. You see, for most of you, when you see the thing go by, you don't see the individuals. You don't see the nuances. You don't understand the differences and how there are some people who have come to the conclusion that they're better off blowing themselves up than not, all right? You see the word Islam or Muslim and you paint the whole group that way. That's what they did to you. See, nobody took the time to sit down and say, well, just who are these people of Japanese ancestry that we're going to lock up? And not understanding that 2/3 were American citizens. They didn't know. That was lost on them. That's a detail. It's something that you have to work at. We, all of us, need to work harder at understanding the people about whom we're forming opinions that may, in most cases, be incorrect. Because until we do that, they're at risk. And if they're at risk, we're all at risk. Because the Constitution is there for all of us to protect us. No better organization exists than this one to begin to educate this community about the realities of 2016. Thank you very much.